And welcome to another Monday Mini. We're going to do a little sleepy mouse today. So I got my little mouse and he's asleep in his little nest and he's gathered him up some acorns. So the first thing I'm going to do is wet the background. My brush is a little dirty, but I'm going to do it with blue anyway, so I'm not worried about it. But I'm going to wet the background and then I am going to drop in some of this dark blue. While it's wet, and just let the water do the work for me. Just let it flow. Got a little on my mouse. I don't want my mouse to be blue, so I picked it up with some tissue. And now I'm just going to go back around that mouse, putting in some of the darker blue. I'm going to pick up a little bit more blue and just add it. It's a little pale for me. Keep in mind it's going to dry just a little bit lighter than it looks right now while it's wet. So I wanted to make it a little bit darker because I don't want it to be too light. I'm going to take a little bit of raw sienna and I'm going to thin it down with lots of water. You want to thin that down. You want it to be nice and watery. And we're just going to paint a nice wash all over our whole mouse. Make sure your background's dry for this. You don't want to bleed the yellow into the blue and make green. We're not trying to make green. We're just trying to get a nice pale wash of raw sienna on our little sleepy pie mouse. So once we wet them pretty good, we just start adding that raw sienna, and places that we want it to be a little bit darker, we add a little bit more. I've got a little tiny bit of burnt orange here. I'm going to start putting that in areas while it's still wet that I want it to be darker on the finished mouse, and just let it blend into that raw sienna. I'm going under his eye. I'm keeping his eye light because my little mouse has like some makeup around his eye. It's really pale. I'm just going to add a few more shadow works where I want shadows to be in the future while it's still wet, with just a little bit of that burnt orange. You can also use burnt sienna if you don't have burnt orange, so don't get too freaked out about it. Just use what you have. I'm going to take a little bit of rose and put it in his ears and at the tip of his little nose. And then I'm just going to blend it out into the rest of the ear. I just painted that rose along one edge and then just taking some clear water and I'm just blending that out. And get his little pink ears in there, his little pink nose. And I'm going to put a little layer of pink right over his tail. Even though I'm going to paint his tail with some fur on it, I still want it to have just a little bit of a pink tint. Now I'm wetting my acorn and I've got some olive green. I'm going to drop that olive green in there and just let the water blend in across the surface of that acorn. And I'm going to take a little bit of burnt sienna, or you can use umber, raw umber, whatever you have that's a darker brown. And I'm just going to add that to the wet acorn just along the edges and let it blend in with that olive green. I'm adding a little bit more olive green just to darken it up. And I'm adding a little bit more brown here to the bottom acorn. And letting that water just blend it out. I'm adding a little bit of a dark shadow under the acorn's little cap. And underneath, I've got just a tiny bit of black, and I'm just dropping it into that wet wash and right underneath the cap of the acorn just to make a shadow, and right along the edge of the mouse. And that just separates the acorn from the mouse and gives it a nice little shadow. Now I'm just taking that same black and just painted in his little eye. And it's fairly thick. It's just has a little bit of water added to it, just enough to make it flow. And I'm going to re-wet him. He's completely dry, but now I'm re-wetting him with some clear water, and I'm going to come back again with a little bit of the burnt orange. Again, you can use whatever brown that you have. You don't have to use the same one that I have. I've also added just a little bit of burnt burnt umber, or either you can use burnt sienna, or you can use some sepia, whatever you have to darken up your burnt orange. And then we're just going to paint it right along his little face, right down his forehead to the tip of his nose. I'm adding a little bit of I'm adding a little bit of sepia right here at the tip of his nose, right down to his little pink nose, and just letting it blend up into that burnt orange and umber mixture. Adding a little bit around at the bottom and around where his tail comes in front of his face so that he has a little shadow. And I'm going to do this under his eye as well, across his little cheeks. And he's looking really cute. I'm just going to add a little bit of the sepia here at the very edges just to darken it up some. I'm going to go around his little fluffy ear. I'm just doing little tick marks where I just want it to look fluffy, and I'm using that darker mixture with the sepia mixed into the brown. I'm coming on around and just painting his little ear in there. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. And I'm going to do some shadows on his tummy where he's all tucked in. He's got his little front paw tucked under his chin, and he's got his back paw tucked under his chin as well. He's all curled up into a nice little slumber, taking him a little nap. And just adding some shadows with that darker brown, adding a little bit of black in there just to darken up some of the spots. Add a little shadow around the cheek area to separate his cheek from that little front paw that he's got tucked under his little chin. And I'm just going to put some hair on his tail with that browns. And you can mix it up. You can use some of the burnt orange, some of the darker brown with the sepia, and just do tiny little hair marks all along his tail just to cover up some of that pink so that his tail is furry. We have a furry-tailed mouse. His tail is not naked. He has a little fur on it because he lives outside and he needs fur on his little tail. And it's my mouse, I can make it like I want to. Just like it's your mouse and you can make your mouse like you want to. I'm just take a little water, I'm wetting this surface again and just putting in some of that burnt orange to add some shadow. Also on his tummy, adding a little bit of burnt orange over that just to sort of soften that up. Right where his tummy's all curled up. I'm going to add some shadows to his back foot that's tucked up under his chin. A little shadow down his haunches. He's such a sweet little mouse. I'm going to add a shadow to the acorns with some of that dark brown, just to separate them from each other and also to separate them from the little mouse. I'm going to add a shadow behind his ear. And just add some of that burnt orange, a little darker brown right behind there. Right behind his little ear. And around where his little arm is tucked under his chin. We're just going to kind of put a little shadow there and under his chin as well. Just trying to define his tiny little arm from his head. I'm just going to add a little bit more shadow work here around his ear, and then we're going to put some on his back with the burnt orange. Just darken up that shadow with some tick marks. and on his little leg. And across the back of his head and across his back. We're just adding a little bit of texture. Just a little bit. And I'm going to add a little darker pink right under his ear so he'll have a shadow, and then just blend it out with some clear water because his ear was a little too white, too pale, so we're adding a little bit more pink in there. And a little bit on his nose. And we're going to put in the cap of the little acorn. I'm just going to put that in with a pale brown, yellow ochre wash, whatever you have, while it's still wet. Well, we're going to let it dry first, and then we're going to come in and we are going to take some olive green mixed with just a tiny bit of brown, and we're going to make the little grass that he's laying on. And we're just putting that directly onto dry paper. This is a longer mini than normal, but I was just in the mood to do a cute little mouse today. So we're putting his little nest around him, if that's what you want to call it. And just using this olive green mixed with just a little bit of brown. And right around his little body and his little ears. Now I've got a little bit more brown mixed with the green, and I'm just going to put that right under him for his shadow, right under the acorns, so that's a little bit darker where he's laying, and it gets lighter as it goes away from him. And just pull some of those shadows out around the tail too. And I'm just going to darken up his little ear here. He needs a little bit more brown, I think, just to darken it up. And put a little fur in his ears too. He doesn't care, he's sleeping. He doesn't know what we're doing to him anyway. We're just painting along. He's just staying asleep. Now I'm going to take some of that black and I'm just going to draw the little, with the brush, just draw a little, the texture of the acorn. And my camera keeps trying to focus on my hand instead of the painting. I apologize. But you can see we're just doing sort of the little squiggly textures of the acorn. And I'm just going to add a little bit darker shadow here underneath them. Using a little bit of green, a little bit of dark blue. And putting a few little twigs here and there going up into the blue background. He's starting to come along, starting to look like a little mouse now. Getting his nest all ready. He's got him some acorns to snack on for later. He's got to have his snacks. And you really don't have to do this much straw under him. I don't know, I'm just getting carried away, I think. But you can do however much you want. But I think I got a little carried away, but I'm not going to worry about it. Now I'm taking some of that burnt orange and I'm just going along the edges of the acorn caps and around the center of this acorn cap that's facing us, but leaving a little bit of that lighter color to peek through so it looks like highlights. Now I am just going to cover the whole entire mouse except for right around his eye with a pale wash of that yellow, I mean not yellow, of the raw sienna. I was going to say yellow ochre, but it's raw sienna. And just cover him, and that sort of warms him up and sort of blends him all together. And I'm just going to add a little shadows to his eyelids and around his eye. And just darken up his tail just a tad bit. And darken up the shadows on the acorn caps. And on his little nosy there. And around his ear, just define it a little better. It's almost too fuzzy, so we gotta make a solid edge there just so that you can really see that ear. And I'm just gonna add a little bit of the brown right over the acorns, just a little wash to warm it up. And I'm gonna take that olive green, a little bit of brown mixture, and just pull it on out into the foreground. And just blend it around with the brush. And just add a little bit more of the browns and a little bit more of the green and let that dry completely. Now I'm coming in with a really dark blue mixture and putting that right around the edge of him just for a little bit more shadows. And I'm just going to pull out a few more little strands of grass and straw, his little nest there, using that same dark color that I used for the shadows around him. I'm just going to add a little bit of texture right here around his eye, the top of his eye, or where his eye is, and a little shadow here so you can see the top of his forehead and his neck are separated. I'm making a little darker brown and making a little more of a shadow behind his ear. And we're about to call him complete, I think. I'm just adding a few more shadows here and there, just a little bit. You really can stop now. I'm probably overworking him just a touch. And just blending it out with some clean water. There you go. He is looking really cute. My little mini sleeping mouse. I think those ears are too pink, so I'm going to come in and I'm going to just put a little bit of that blue over his ears because they're too pink and they stand out a little too much. So just put a little bit of that blue over the pink of his nose and his ears. And I think he's done. Now we'll just let him sleep and have sweet dreams. Sweet little mouse. Like and follow for more tips and be sure to hit that notification button so you'll know when the next video is coming.